So, thank you very much to those of you who have arranged this meeting for inviting me. Yes, I am here primarily for Ellie's bar mitzvah, but this is my fourth time here in Perth, and in every time I've been here, I've been overwhelmed by the hospitality that I've been given and the welcome that I've been given by everybody here. And this time has been no exception. Everybody has been so kind and welcoming. And of course, it's great for me to be able to see my children in action and my grandchildren in their own environment. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And thank you for inviting me to talk. So there were two things that Dr. Michael Levitt asked me to talk about. And I think the way we'll do this, with your permission, is I'll talk about Brit Milah for a little while. And then the other thing I wanted to talk about was end-of-life issues and the halakha, because I think there are quite a lot of gaps in knowledge, generally speaking, about how Judaism interacts with end-of-life issues. And I'm aware that here in Western Australia, there is a lot of controversy about this voluntary euthanasia act. And so I think that's a subject that we should touch on as well. And so I'll spend a few minutes talking about that. There are handouts which will be available afterwards. If you just give Dan your email address, he can email them to you. He's got them all there. And of course, I'll give you my email address. If anyone's got any questions at a later date, feel free to contact me. Happy to do that. And then, of course, at the end of this, if there's any questions, we'll try and deal with those. So I'll start with talking about Brit Milah. And specifically, the threat, the international threat to Brit Milah, and what, if anything, can we do about that? And I live in Israel now. And it's a given that 95%, let's say, of the Jews and 100% of the Muslims in Israel circumcise their children. And there is no threat from the government to Brit Milah in Israel. However, I've only been in Israel 10 years. And prior to that, I was a Moil in the UK. I became a Moil in 1991. And over that period of time, I've seen the threat to Brit Milah in the UK rise, and internationally rise and rise again. Now, why did I become a Moil in the first place? That's an important question, which impinges on what Dr. Levitt said before, and that is that we need doctors to be Moilim. The man, Zichrono Livracha, a great man called Dayan Chanoch Ehrentreu, some of you may have heard of him. He was, until recently, he passed away very recently in the last few months. He was the Av Bet Din in London. And prior to that, he was the Av Bet Din in Manchester. He was a Moil, as well as being a very impressive man, a rabbi, a dayan, a moil, a man of the highest caliber. But perhaps his most important quality was his foresight. How old are you? 38 years ago, 39 years ago perhaps, Dayan Ehrentreu said to my partner in GP practice, Dr. David Hibbert, said, David, I want you to train as a Moil. This was 2 or 3 years before Dan was born. He says, I want you to train as a Moil because there will come a time when people will not have a Brit for their children unless it is done by a doctor. There will come a time, this was 39 years ago, he said, when Brit Milah in this country, meaning the UK, will not be allowed unless it is done by a doctor. That was great foresight. So Dr. Hibbert became a Moil. I joined his practice. Dr. Hibbert's a few years older than me. I joined his practice as he was coming to the end of his training as a mohel. And then I trained as well, if you like, in his footsteps. And between us, we were two of the most busy mohelim in Manchester, amongst the non-Haredi community, because we were doctors. And as those 39 years have gone on, Dayan Ehrentreu's words were prophetic. Now in the UK, amongst the less committed Jews, shall we say, there are people who will only have a Brit done by a doctor. And if there's no doctor available to do it, then they won't have a Brit for their children. Now that puts a massive responsibility on us as doctors, because as you're aware, Milah is a fundamental of Judaism. Okay? We can debate about medical and non-medical benefits, and we'll see as we go along, but it's a fundamental. So it's very important, and I'm delighted to be able to have an opportunity to speak to doctors who have an opportunity here to be really fundamental in the performance of one of our most important mitzvot, of Brit Milah. It's really important. Now, how does this? Oh yes, there we go. So let's have a quick whiz through a bit of history. Okay, this banning Brit Milah is nothing new, as you can see here. It goes right back to Antiochus Epiphanes, story of the Maccabees, Hanukkah. Okay, you're all familiar with that story, I'm sure. One of the things that the Greeks under Antiochus did was to ban Brit Milah in the year 170 BCE. 200 or 300 years later, under the rule of the Romans, the Emperor Hadrian also banned Brit Milah. Many people believe that the impetus for the Maccabees to revolt was the banning of Brit Milah, because they said this is so fundamental, we have to revolt against this Antiochus. Same with Bar Kokhba. The Bar Kokhba revolt in 132 CE was spurred on, many people believe, by the banning of Brit Milah. 1442, this Council of Basel, Florence, the Catholic Church, they said that this was a non-Christian thing to do, because there was this Brit Chadash, this new covenant, and they described circumcision as a mortal sin and ordered against its practice in this Council of Basel, Florence. The 18th century, the French Revolution, it was this considered, it came under attack, ridicule and accusations of barbarism and primitivism began to be commonplace at that time. And then, of course, we, as often is the case, we are our own worst enemies, and the Reform movement, Reform Jewish movement in the 19th century in Germany tried to ban and distance itself, not ban, distance itself from circumcision. 1842, the Frankfurt Association of Friends of Reform called for the abolition of circumcision in Judaism. As it so happens, they were not successful. And 3 years later, in 1845, it disbanded because of lack of membership. So Brit Milah survived, and the Frankfurt Association calling for the abolition of circumcision did not survive. And then the wheel goes around, and the tax on circumcision abated because it became very popular amongst the British royal family, for example, and in America, up until fairly recently, over 90% of boys born in America were circumcised. It's less now, but until fairly recently, it was very, very high percentages of boys were circumcised as a routine at birth. Crown Prince Charles, this is a report in the Times newspaper of November 1948. Crown Prince Charles, son of Princess Elizabeth and heir to the British throne, today King Charles III, was circumcised in Buckingham Palace by the Reverend Jacob Snowman, official mohel of the London Jewish community. Reverend Snowman, who is a noted Jewish scholar specializing in the poetry of Bialik, has been ritual circumciser in London for many years. He has published several volumes on leading Hebrew writers. Okay? Prince Charles, now King Charles, had his circumcision by a mohel. So it became very popular. In the British royal family, I understand, I don't have any proof of this, not seen it myself, but I'm told that Prince William is the first royal for many generations not to have a circumcision, as Diana wouldn't allow it. Don't know whether that's true or not, but I just know. Anyway, we have been very fortunate in our lives, in the UK particularly, that we've been free to practice our religion. The UK opened its doors to my grandparents and many others, the end of the 19th century, running away from pogroms, etc. And we were free to practice our religion whenever, however we saw fit. And there was a tolerance, if not acceptance, there was a tolerance of our ritual practices. But this is sort of changing now. The times they are changing, as said by a good Jewish boy, Robert Zimmerman. There is now very thinly veiled attacks on shechita in the UK, and similarly, great many attacks across the whole of Europe against Brit Milah. Now, if they banned shechita, what would we do? What would we do? We'd become vegetarian, or else we'd import meat from somewhere else. We would manage, right? They banned shechita wherever it was. We'd manage. Either we'd do without meat, or we'd bring it in from somewhere else. But what if they banned Milah? Then what are we going to do? This is such a fundamental of our religion. And if it's banned, what are we going to do? Sure, we'll do it underground and people will, and it'd be like the old days of backstreet abortions where people got infections and things were done badly and then they were It's a horrendous thought. So we need to think about this. We need to think about what is the threat and how we can avoid that. There have been recent, why has that not gone on? Why have I not, my next slide not come on? Again? Come and help me down, please, quick. This is not, what I've got on my screen is not what you've got there, and it should be because there's this thing. Why isn't it coming on? Okay, it's not coming on. What can I do? Victor Schonfeld, anybody heard of him? The filmmaker. He made a film in 1994-5 called It's a Boy. It was a horrendous film. And it was, I'll read to you what the advertising blurb said. The documentary focuses on the unforgettable chronology of a religious circumcision with serious complications and contains impressive scenes concerning the injuries and suffering of Jewish, Muslim, and African babies by the engagement. The film was selected as Show of the Year by the British newspaper, The Independent, surprise, surprise, and is considered the most powerful and most authoritative documentation of boy circumcision. It was horrendous. It was horrendous. It showed how many, with the Milah who are here, who are the Milah? Hands up, who are the Milah? Okay. What are your complication rates of circumcision? Tiny, right? 1 in 1,000. Right. I did over 1,000 britot before I moved to Israel. Baruch Hashem. Not one ever had to go to hospital. Not one. Okay. Less than 1 in 1,000. Right. 1 in 1,000. Very, very, very small. What is the complication rate in medical circumcision? Much higher. Okay. Much higher. So this film that Victor Schonfeld did was completely biased and designed for one thing only, and that was to agitate against Brit Milah. In Sweden in 2001, sorry that I can't show you this, but if you want the handout later or the slides, I can send them to you. 2001 in Sweden, it became exactly what Diane Ehrentreu said to us in 1980. He was born in 86. 87. So said to David Hibbert in about 1984, in Sweden in 2001, it became a medical only procedure with anesthesia. In 2007, the British Medical Journal made a whole debate about this, and there was tremendous uproar after this British Medical Journal articles, which are very anti-Brit Milah. October 2013, the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe asked its member states to seriously consider the physical integrity of children and voted on adopting a report which was very critical of circumcision. The report focused largely on the practice of female genital mutilation, but also brought in on its sort of coattails, if you like, circumcision of boys. The report in its current form does not call for a ban, but it urges European countries to adopt legislation defining the medical and legal conditions under which circumcision can take place. In other words, they're putting the shackles on. Now, in Denmark, the Social Liberal Party, a small coalition partner of Denmark's ruling Social Democratic Party, adopted a firm anti-circumcision stance. Sweden, Norway, okay, it's all these places in Scandinavia are at the forefront of banning or trying to ban Brit Milah. So I want to focus, if I can, on this is not even connecting now, so switch that off and now try it again. I want to focus on broadly. There are 5 attacks that the anti-Milah folk want to try and do. Okay, there are broadly five categories. And if I had the slide on, I would have these 5 categories. Actually, it's 6, but 2 of them are together. Number 1, it's barbaric, it's primitive, and it has no place in modern society. Okay? That's familiar. You're familiar with that. Number 2, it causes unnecessary pain. Number 3, it infringes the child's human rights. Number 4, female genital mutilation is illegal, so social circumcision. Number 5, metzitza b'peh, oral suction of the penis can cause illness to babies, transmit infection, and endangers their lives. And number 6, if you have to allow circumcision, it should only be done by registered medical practitioners with very defined circumstances. Those are basically the 6 different categories of attack. And I'm going to go through each one of those and see if there's anything that we can do to try and counter the attacks that are on Brit Milah. So number 1, it's barbaric and primitive and there's no place in modern society. There was once, well, every now and again they have, in the UK, they bring out an anti-Milah thing, and so the TVs get hold of it. And one of these times, there was a TV program on daytime TV about circumcision, and this guy called Kilroy Silk, who was a TV presenter, also a lawyer, and brought together the anti-Milah brigade and the Jewish community were asked to bring somebody. The Muslim community came. The guy that was representing the Jewish community was a guy called Dr. Yossi Spitzer, also a GP and a Moyle. And so the guy said, Dr. Spitzer, why do the Jews do circumcision? And Dr. Spitzer said, because God said so. And Kilroy Silk, who was no fool, said, right. He said, well, that's the end of that discussion then, isn't it? And that is the answer to that. We have to say, you think it's primitive, you think it's barbaric, I'm sorry, but we beg to differ. This is a mitzvah in the Torah. This is our ot, our sign. This has been the sign of the Jewish people for thousands of years. We believe that God said we should do circumcision on our male children. Now, if you don't believe that God said you should do circumcision, then why would you do it? All of those things that the anti-Milah brigade would say, they're all fairly good arguments. We're going to go through each one of them and we'll see that there are differences of opinion. But the bottom line is, it's part of our religion. This is what we do. And there is no trumping that. And Kilroy Silk was correct. That's the end of the discussion. in term for the Jew. The believing Jew will always do circumcision on their children because God said so. So, number two. What was number two? Number two was it causes unnecessary pain. Okay. Now, when I first started as a Milah, the official line was, there is very little pain, it doesn't hurt. Okay. I don't think that's a tenable position anymore. There have been many, many studies to show that heart rate goes up, sweating goes up. It's not tremendously painful. We know that, don't we? Because we've all been through it. We've all had our children go through it. We know that the discomfort for the baby is on a low level, but it's not a tenable position to say there is no pain. So what can we do about it? Well, in my career as a Milah, there was introduced a product called Milah. You have Milah here? Okay, Milah cream. Okay, it's not actually licensed for under 12 months old in the UK. I don't know if it is here, because it can cause methemoglobinemia in 1 in 10 zillion cases. But we all use it, and it can be used. You put this Milah on. It's the stuff that people put on their kids when they're having blood taken. Put it on for an hour, it goes numb. The beauticians use it when they're doing whatever they do to remove hairs on ladies' faces, etc. It's a local anesthetic, and I've been using it for 20 odd years. Thank God, not had any problems with it. It can sometimes make the area swell a bit, and it can make it a little bit more technically difficult to do the circumcision. But any small amount of discomfort that there is reduced, and there have been studies shown that the use of Milah does reduce the heart rate and the sweating and all those other factors that can show that there's some discomfort. And I believe that we should be at least offering this to all parents of whom we do the circumcision, because we need to be doing whatever we can within halakha, make circumcision as palatable to the anti-circumcision people as possible. For us, we're doing it because God said so. Doesn't mean we have to hurt the baby unnecessarily. We have to do whatever we can to reduce that. There are some Moalim and some rabbis who say, no, you're not allowed to use anesthetic. And the baby has to cry, and it's all part of the procedure. I don't hold of that one little bit. It's an opinion. It's a very extreme opinion, and it's not, in my humble opinion, compatible with 21st century practice in a non-Jewish world. Okay, if you're in Stamford Hill in London, or you're in Bnei Brak, or if you're in Mea Sha'arim Yerushalayim, and you want to go along that line, that's fine. It's not compatible with practice in non-Jewish world. Yes. Okay. So just for the recording, the question was, if we can use Milah, can we not use any other kind of local anesthetic? And the answer is yes, you can. And you can do a penile block. You can use a local anesthetic, some lidocaine or whatever, and a penile block. We always said, and maybe it's just because we weren't very good at doing it, that actually doing the penile block was more painful than actually doing the Brit Milah. Whereas with Milah, there's no pain involved because it's obviously a local anesthetic. But there's no reason why you can't do a penile block. We use the penile block if we do adults. Okay, when we do adults or older children, we use a penile block, of course. So there's absolutely no reason why not in mainstream halakha why you cannot use anesthetic. So if you want to use Milah, I personally think it should be offered to every Brit. Not everybody will want it. Not everybody parent will want you to use that, because there is this very small risk of methemoglobinemia, and they might not want to take that risk. They should be offered it with information, in my opinion. Penile block, particularly if it's an older child, you might want to consider that. You can certainly use anesthetic. So that was point number 2. Point number 3 is a very thorny problem, getting thornier in our time, and that is it infringes on the baby's human rights. Okay, now here the anti-Milah lobby argue that since circumcision is harmful to the child, why is it harmful? Well, there are potential complications. We know that the complication rate is extremely low, but there are potential complications. And their main beef is that there is an alleged reduction in sensitivity of the circumcised penis versus the non-circumcised penis. I'm not sure how they can do a controlled trial on that, because you can't ask a person, did you, was it before, before and after kind of thing, in any meaningful way. So, but nevertheless, there is an idea put out there that there is reduced sensitivity in the circumcised penis. That being the case, they argue that the court must protect this innocent, defenseless child from this damage that's being inflicted on him without his consent. And of course, at 8 days old, he can't give consent. And they say, well, if he wants to have a circumcision, wait until he's 18. They don't mind, by the way, if he's 7 years old and he decides he wants to have gender reassignment and they want to take the whole lot away. That's not a problem. But circumcision, no, we have to wait until he's 18, until he makes his own decisions. And they quote Article 24, subclause 3 of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which commits all ratifying states, listen carefully, quote, to take all effective and appropriate measures with a view to abolishing traditional practices prejudicial to the health of children. What's that article all about? Female genital mutilation. But it was worded very, very carefully so that it would give succor to those who wanted to interpret that. I'll say it again. Take all effective and appropriate measures with a view to abolishing traditional practices prejudicial to the health of children. And they would say, circumcision is prejudicial to the health of children. And therefore, the United Nations Charter, Convention on the Rights of the Child, commits all states to taking measures to abolish such practices. And that's a very, very powerful argument. Now, there was this article, I mentioned the BMJ in 2007. This was a chap called Hinchley, Dr. Hinchley. And he wrote in this article, quote, it cannot be in the best interest of a child to be subjected without its consent to an irreversible surgical procedure, often without anesthetic, which will provide no medical benefit, but which has proved adverse consequences, both in terms of potential complications for some and reduced penile sensation in adulthood for all. Has anybody here had an article published in the BMJ? Anybody? Okay, now Professor, when you had your article in the BMJ, whichever article you wrote, I'm sure you probably had many there in the BMJ, it was subjected to tremendous scrutiny, correct? Peer review. Every single word was measured carefully before it passed there. How did that get through when it says, will provide no medical benefit? Is that approved? Is it proved that circumcision causes no medical benefit? When I was in medical school, I was told that circumcision reduces the incidence of penile cancer. Is that not a benefit? I would have thought it's beneficial to have less penile cancer. I was taught that it reduces the amount of cervical cancer in the sexual partners of circumcised men because of the HPV virus, which lives in the smegma underneath the foreskin, etc., etc. So Hinchley managed to get into the BMJ words that said it provides no medical benefit, which has proved adverse consequences. Can you see the subtle approach here that the BMJ allowed in 2007? Now, fortunately for us, a chap called Professor Michael Freeman. Anybody heard of him? Great man. He's not actually. He's Professor of English Law at UCL. I know who you mean. He's also called Michael Freeman, the justice, but this is a different one. This is a Professor of English Law at UCL, University College London. He's published over 60 books and numerous papers, and he's written extensively on this topic. And he argues the other side of the coin. This is a real typical Gomorrah cop. And he says like this: Professor Freeman argues that far from being an abuse of the child's human rights, the performance of Brit Milah is an actual human right itself of the child, and not to circumcise the child of an Orthodox Jewish family, or indeed a practicing Muslim family, may itself be an abuse of the child's human rights. And he says, quote, "It is necessary to examine a specific child in the context of a specific home. Abuse in one context is not necessarily abuse in another. Context also includes culture. It is not reasonable to expect every parent to have a male baby circumcised, but it would be unreasonable to expect a Jewish parent or a Muslim parent not to do so. Far from ritual circumcision constituting abuse, it is arguable that the failure by Jewish or Muslim parents to do so is abuse, the child being likely to suffer significant harm," meaning that when he's older, he then has to undergo a procedure in order to perform his ritual duty, and he has freedom of religion. That's also part of the UN Charter, is freedom of religion. He then has to undergo a procedure when he's 13, 18, 20, 50, whatever he is, which is a jolly sight more difficult, problematic, and potentially with complications than it is at 8 days old. So Professor Freeman argues the other side of the coin. What he's saying is that by not having Brit Milah at 8 days old, the child is likely to suffer harm both physically, as I've said, but also psychologically, because he's going to be different from his peer group. Imagine the kid that goes to Carmel school and he's not had a Brit Milah. I remember when I went to a Jewish junior school, and then I went to a non-Jewish secondary school at the age of 10. I remember the first week that I was there, nobody prepared me for this. We were in the showers after sports. We were doing sports. First week, the end of the first week, we had sports. We're all in the showers there. Quick glance over there. What's wrong with him? I don't look right. And I look at the next one, and he don't look right either. I was the only Jewish boy in the class. I'm thinking, what's wrong with him? And what's wrong with it? And I'm thinking, what's wrong with me? Right? I was different. I was different to all of them. Imagine that's the other way around. Imagine the kids that are in Carmel school in the showers, and there's a kid there that's not had a circumcision. You can imagine kids can be very cruel. There's a kind of potential for psychological harm as well. This is what Professor Freeman argues. And crucial to this point is whether circumcision confers medical benefit or medical harm, or both, or neither. Hinchley said no proven benefits, but proven harm. Well, that just tells you, all that tells you is what Hinchley's approach was and what his aims were. And it also tells you that the BMJ did not apply the same rigor that they applied to the professor's papers that they did to Hinchley's paper. But the possible health benefits, reduction in urinary tract infection, reduction in cancer of the penis, reduction in cervical cancer, reduction in HIV, reduction in STDs. However, I'm not interested in any of that, because if we try and defend Brit Milah on the basis of its medical benefits, we can see what we're up to. We're up against Hinchley. We're up against those kind of people, Victor Schonfeld. We're up to the people who are not interested in that at all. And what if all those benefits that we have been taught over and over again come from Brit Milah, the reduction in this and the reduction in that, what if we find out, new research says, you know what? It's not true. It doesn't reduce penile cancer. It doesn't reduce cervical cancer. It doesn't reduce HIV. Doesn't reduce UTIs. We're going to stop doing it? No. Why? Because of what Dr. Yossi Spitzer said. We do it because God said so. So the approach, which was very common when I was a young boy, which was to try and push it on the benefit. Oh, so we're so advanced. We were so advanced 3,500 years ago. We knew, didn't we, that all these medical benefits were conferred by Brit Milah. They may or may not. It's not relevant because we do it because God said so. And I think it's a dangerous approach to take, to try and defend Brit Milah on the basis of its health benefits. If there are health benefits, and I happen to believe there are, that's great. That's an added bonus. But to use it to defend Brit Milah, in my opinion, is a dangerous approach, because we could then be in problem. Next one. I'm rushing because I know we've not got a lot of time. The next anti-Milah argument is number 4. Female genital mutilation is illegal, and therefore male circumcision should also be illegal. And Professor Freeman, who I spoke about before, he wrote a learned paper in the British Journal of Urology, 1999. And he basically, what he was saying is that that article in the UN was talking about FGM, but it was couched in United Nations language, which was then hijacked by the anti-Milah lobby, and they fudged the issue. And the language was used is what is known as, inverted commas, a diplomatic compromise. Okay, typical diplomatic language, which can be interpreted in any way you like. That's what diplomacy is all about, isn't it? You can say X, and party A think that X means X, and party B think that X means Y. And then it's already a very clever diplomatic language. So the UN Charter did nobody any favors there at all. But the major difference between circumcision and female genital mutilation is that there is overwhelming agreement that FGM causes harm and brings no benefit at all. Whereas, as we said before, there is, at the very worst, medical disagreement about the benefit-risk ratio of circumcision. It is not the same as FGM, and it cannot be lumped together with FGM, and we must resist the concept of lumping circumcision together with FGM, because it does not cause significant harm to the child, as stated in the convention. The diplomatic language that was used allows for that interpretation for the reasons that we said. And now I want to come on to one of the things which I think is probably the most important part of all that I'm going to say about Brit Milah today, and that is my hobby horse for the last 25 years, and that is Metsitsa Vapeh. For those that don't know what that is, part of the traditional circumcision process was oral genital suction. The moil sucked the cut end of the penis with his mouth, and that was part of the circumcision process. I can see there's a lady over there who's, I don't know, who's got a sour face, look on her face right now, and you are quite right. Okay, you are quite right. Now, where does it all come from? What do we have to do halachically for a Brit Milah? We have to remove the foreskin, and we have to reveal the atara, the glans penis, and the coronal sulcus has to be revealed. That is all you have to do. Two things: chituch, removing the foreskin; priya, reflecting down the mucous membrane, so that you reveal the head of the penis. Many, many, many years ago, many centuries ago, the rabbis thought and said that oral suction of the penis enhanced the healing process. It was a medical, a rabbinic medical addition to Brit Milah. If you do a Brit Milah and you take off the foreskin and you forget to do the priya, you forget to peel back the mucous membrane and reveal the sulcus, is that a kosher Brit? No. What happens if you do those two things? You put the bandage on, you slip the baby back to the mother, and forgot to do mitzitza. Is that a kosher Brit? Yes. It is not ma'akev, as we say. If you even forget to do it, because it's not part of the halachic process, it has become part of the tradition to do it. And it's an important tradition for many people, but it doesn't have to be done with the mouth. It can be done with a pipette, which is the way I always do it, and I'm sure that the doctors here do it. You have a pipette, small, sterile glass tube, place it over the top of where you've done the Brit. You have a piece of cotton wool inside the thing. You suck up with a pipette, no oral genital contact whatsoever, completely sterile. you have satisfied every possible opinion that you have done metzitza, which is this suction, and you have not caused any oral genital contact. Now, I have been battering on this subject for many, many years because there is a very, very strong feeling amongst certain sections of the community, the ultra-Orthodox sections of the community, that says we cannot mess with traditions. Tradition was always you did it with the mouth, and that's how you have to do it. And it's not the case. It is not the case, and we should not be doing it. You imagine a scenario where, I don't know what the equivalent, what's the equivalent of Daily Mail here? Daily Mail, okay, so you have the Daily Mail, okay? The Daily Mail. Imagine the Daily Mail sends an undercover reporter to a Brit, okay? And he sees the Milah here in Perth don't have long beards, but let's imagine that, you know, you're in London and they've got long beards, long black coats, and this fellow leans over the baby, puts his mouth over the penis and sucks. The guy undercover takes a photograph. It's on the front page of the Daily Mail the next day. How long do you think it'll be before Brit Milah is banned? 5 minutes. No chance we would have, okay? And it's not part of Brit Milah. It was thought to be a part of the healing process many centuries ago. There were lots of things that were thought to be medically important by the rabbis. The rabbis were very clever people, but they only knew the science of their day. They didn't know about electricity or the internet, and they didn't know about modern medicine either. Okay, they didn't know. It was a long time before Lister and all the antiseptic things. They didn't know. We know today that there have been cases of babies who have died from herpes infection contracted by metzitza b'peh. It should not happen in the 21st century. It shouldn't have happened in the 20th century either, but it should not happen today in the 21st century. And that is an extremely important thing. Now, I have no doubt that here in Perth, there's nobody that does metzitza b'peh, but that is not the case in many places. And I firmly and strongly believe that we, as doctors and as Milah, amongst ourselves, I don't think this should be published out in the big wide world, but amongst ourselves, we should be putting pressure on, I don't know if you have an association of Milah in Australia like we have in the UK, the Initiation Society, which is the oldest Jewish association in the whole of the UK, 17 something or other it was established. It's part of the rules of the Initiation Society that metzitza b'peh should not be done. Problem is, they don't enforce the rules. So that metzitza b'peh is the thing that is most likely to get Milah banned in places like the UK and in Europe. And there are people that are just, to me, it's amazing. There's never happened before now that somebody has not photographed this and caused it. So that's a very, very important thing. And the final argument against Brit Milah is number 6, and that is, if you have to allow it, it has to be done by doctors with proper training and proper regulation. Now, I happen to agree with part of that. It needs to be regulated and trained. I don't think it needs to be a doctor. It's not a difficult procedure. It can be taught to somebody who's not a doctor very easily. But there needs to be proper regulation. There needs to be proper training with training logs and regular reaccreditation. I have to go through an appraisal every 12 months as a doctor in the UK. I have to go through a rigorous appraisal. I have to be revalidated every 5 years. If I don't do my appraisal every year for those 5 years and show that I've kept up to date and done all the things that I need to do, I won't get revalidated and I won't be able to practice. And that's how it should be for Brit Milah. There needs to be an organization. The Initiation Society in the UK is the obvious organization. If there isn't one in Australia, there should be one, and they should have a set training procedure, and that you should have to go and undergo this rigorous training, a rigorous examination before you're allowed to do it, a certain amount of supervision, a number of procedures that you have to do to be supervised, and then before you're allowed to fly solo. The old medical adage of see one, do one, teach one, which is, you know, the old-fashioned way of that doesn't hold water. You can't do that. You've got to have, when you're dealing with something like this, which is so sensitive, especially if it's not done by medically qualified people. It doesn't need to be done by a doctor. It's not a difficult thing to do. But you do need to know what to do if it goes not quite the way you'd like it to go. Like every procedure that you do. Any dentists here? Any dentists? Okay, no dentists here. Okay, ask any dentist. What about an extraction? Not difficult to do an extraction. What's difficult is to know what to do if the tooth breaks halfway out, right? In any medical procedure that you do, the skill is to get out of trouble when it goes wrong. And that's the same for a Brit Milah. The training must be rigorous. The regulation must be rigorous. And not only that, we must be seen to be regulated and seen to be trained. And again, the Initiation Society in the UK has very rigorous training, very rigorous regulation, but they don't stick to it. And that's a big problem. So it's very, very important that when somebody turns around and says, oh, this circumciser, what, you know, how can you allow a non-medical person to do such a procedure? Well, I tell you how, because look at the training he has to go through. Look at the rigorous training. Look at the regulation. Every year he has to, and the other thing is, you have to be able to do a certain number to carry on doing it. Since I moved to Israel, I've not done anywhere near as many as I did in the UK, because as you can imagine, there's one mile on every street corner, right? And I haven't advertised, and I don't really want to do it, because all the Brits I did in the UK, I never took any payment for it. It was my mitzvah, and I didn't want to take payment for it, and I didn't want to take payment for it when I went to Israel. But that's a problem, because in Israel, the Moalim do it as their living. So if I'm going to come along in my community and I'm doing it for free, I'm going to affect his livelihood, aren't I? Here's this English doctor comes along, and I'm going to do it for free. Well, they're not going to go to him if I'm going to pay, 1,000 shekels when they can come to me and do it for free. So I don't advertise it. So I just do it for friends and family. But you know what? I'm getting a bit de-skilled because I haven't done enough. And there's going to come a point, probably in the not too distant future, where I'm going to say, you know what? I don't think I should be doing this anymore, because I'm not keeping up with the practice like everything else. It's not like riding a bike, right? Well, it is like riding a bike. You try riding a bike when you haven't done it for 50 years. What happened to Grandpa? My father, blessed memory, came, the kids had a bike. He said, I've not been on a bike for years. Come on, let me have a go. And he fell off. That's what happens. So, the regulation, the training is really, really important. We have to be seen to be doing. Now, at the end of the day, we Jews will continue to do Brit Milah, come what may, because of what Dr. Yossi Spitzer said, which I began with. We do it because God said so. But that doesn't mean that we can be arrogant about it and we can be cavalier about it. We have to do it in a way that is the most acceptable way to everybody else, without compromising our own religious beliefs and our own religious practice. And it's not a case of ne'er the twain shall meet. It is possible to do it in a way which is acceptable, not to people like Hinchley and Schonfeld, because they're not rational. They're not interested in listening to arguments against them. Not talking about them. You'll always have people who are trying to get it banned. However, the vast majority of people are open to debate, are open to listening about it. And if we want to be successful in avoiding the banning of Brit Milah in places like the UK and Australia and Europe and places other than Israel where Jews and Muslims are in the majority, then we have to have sensitivities. I'm not suggesting for one moment that we go against our principles and the way we do things, but it's possible to have the best of both worlds. And unfortunately, there are many of our Moalim, certainly when I say our, I'm talking about in the UK, who don't do us any favors. And I have spent many, many hours trying to push this idea, but whether I've been successful or not, I don't know, but I can tell you I'm going to carry on trying as best as I can. That's a very, very quick whiz through the way I see the threat to Brit Milah and what we can do to change it. But for you guys, I would reiterate what Dr. Levitt said, and I reiterate what Diane Ehrenholz said nearly 40 years ago. doctors, please, young doctors especially, please train to be moilim, because if you don't, then there'll be people who will not do a Brit for their children unless it's done by a doctor. And that is absolutely, I know that's a bit of a guilt trip, but we're good at guilt trips in Judaism, aren't we? I'm putting the guilt trip here on the young doctors. And not just doctors, but especially doctors, because parents will want it done by doctors. Yeah. Yeah, let me just say for the recording, because they won't have heard what you said. The question was, should we, in a way, concede that point that it should only be doctors who do it because it's not compromising our way of doing? The answer is yes, as long as we have enough doctors to do it. The problem we have is where there are places, if we concede that point, that can only be done by doctors, and there are no moilim, like for example in Russia, in the Soviet era, it was very, very difficult because there weren't any moilim. The moilim had to be brought from God knows where. My own Rebbe, my own person that taught me Milah, used to go to Soviet Russia, and they would line him up, hundreds of. He would go for 2 weeks, and they would do Brit Milah, children and adults, from morning till night. So you have to do a Brit by the day, during the day, by the way. You can't do a Brit at night. And these moilim, I never went to Russia, but my teacher went to Russia with a few other. Dr. Sifman was one of them, and Dr. Spitzer, who I mentioned before, was one of them. And they did Brit Milah from the second of dawn until sunset, when it was no longer. So much so, they didn't even stop to daven mincha. During that whole time, for those 2 weeks that they were there, except on Shabbat, they did not daven mincha. And we're talking about rabbis, and they did not say afternoon prayers. Why? Because they were busy with the mitzvah of Brit Milah from morning until night. There was no time to stop for mincha. That's how important it was. And so the problem is that if we had a situation, we concede that. And if we had to concede it, I would concede it, because it's better than, saying, well, we can't do it at all. But if that's the case, and it's going that way, you're quite right. How much more important it is that we get Dr. Moilim. We must have Dr. Moilim. Really, really important. Yes, sir. Okay. Now, that's a good question. The question was for the recording, can a female person, a woman, do a Brit Milah? A female doctor, okay? Well, let's ask the halachic question. Can a female do a Brit Milah halachically? Anybody can think of a scenario where we know that a woman did a Brit Milah? Sipporah, correct. Sipporah, the wife of Moshe. Here was a situation where the child of Moshe, Gershom, had not had a Brit Milah for whatever reason. That's another good question. Why didn't Moshe Rabbeinu do a Brit Milah? But he didn't. Whatever reason he didn't, his wife, Sipporah, went ahead and did the Brit Milah and staved off a disaster. Moshe was struck down with an illness because he hadn't done this mitzvah of Brit Milah on his child. Sipporah saved the day. Halachically, a woman can do a Brit Milah. Is it done? No. Generally speaking, it is not done that a woman does a Brit Milah. If a woman does a Brit Milah, a Jewish woman does a Brit Milah with all the correct things that are done, is it a kosher Brit? Does he need to go back and have some other kind of procedure? No, it is a kosher Brit. Is it done? Generally in Orthodox situations? No. If you ask me personally, what's a better option? For a woman to do a Brit Milah or for the child not to have a Brit Milah at all? It's a no-brainer. Of course the woman should do the Brit Milah. And there are places in Israel, in various places in America where there is a mohelet. It is a standard thing. It's not generally done in Orthodox circles. And I'm not advocating for women to do this Brit Milah, but can they do it halachically? In certain circumstances, yes, they can. Yes, look, please do. You go over there, and everybody else will be able to hear you.
Not sure they want that. I thought I'd better tell you what we do in Perth. So Stephen and I are the two Molim, and we probably do about 20 brisses a year each, I would think. About 20 each. And that's not enough to get expertise. It's just not enough. You're not going to see enough variation in anatomy of very different complications. You're going to get a bit arrogant that you haven't had any problems so far in 2 years, but you've only done 40. So when Steve first trained, he did several hundred in my clinic. So in my clinic, I do about 1,000 a year. Half of them are Muslims, 20 are Jews. And the rest are Africans, Americans, Australians of different backgrounds, European origin. So there's a training program for anyone. That's why Steve is so good at it, because he just did lots and lots and lots with supervision and with support. And now he does them for the community with great skill. But even he and I, from time to time, come together on a difficult case or a complicated problem. So there is a training program available, but I don't believe any of us should be taking this on unless you're prepared to do regular brisses. You really ought to be working at my clinic, doing a whole lot over a number of years like Steve did. And I think that's pretty important, because I'm the oldest oil here, and there'll be a time when I won't be doing it. And someone needs to train, and there's a perfect vehicle for that training. And but I think they need to keep doing it. I've done over 19,000 circumcisions, and that's a hell of a lot of variations of anatomy, and I'm still learning. So there is a capacity for a young Jewish doctor to come and train and learn and be supervised and continue to work and make money. The Muslims are prepared to pay. I don't know how they find the money. They're prepared to pay for it because it's essential for them. It also means to me, because of that experience, I don't see that we're going to lose the capacity to Brit Milah. They're going to push hard. They do push me hard already, because the Aboriginal community still need that capacity, and the Muslim community.
The Aboriginal community also
Aboriginal, yeah, it's a different sort of process, and it's really only the traditional rural or outback Aboriginal people that do it, but they do it.
So that is the strongest. That is the strongest outlet.
That's correct.
UK, big section of the community in the UK now, and they are our allies. But it's a double-edged sword, because many of the Muslim practitioners are, but not too far, not very good, and the complication rate of Muslim circumcisions is so high that in certain areas, myself and my partner, Dr. Hibbert, were brought in by the health authorities in the very highly populated Muslim areas to teach the Muslim practitioners how we do it, because our complication rate was so low and theirs was so high that we were actually brought in to teach them various different techniques.
I've been asked by many people to train them, and I had one Egyptian man surgeon come to me. He watched me do 2 and went to Sydney and said he was trained by me. And he never did them. So I won't train anybody except I'll only train Jewish doctor. I'm not going to train the Muslim community. And because I don't have faith that I'll get any support or only run into trouble.
About the regulation training, it's absolutely vital. It's absolutely vital that any lawyer can bring out his certificate and say, "Here, this is my certificate of training. If I show you my medical degree, you know what I've done. I've done 5 years in medical school. I've done 3 years pre-registration. I've done the X, Y, Z. You know from my certificate what I've done. That's how it should be with a lawyer. If I show you my Milah certificate, you should know that I've done X thousand, watched X hundred, done X under supervision, and have been signed off as competent. I've been regulated regularly. I've been retested regularly, and that should be a gold certificate to know that if I've got one of these certificates, you can trust me. And without that, you should be.
Here we can't do it as a mile. We can do it as a doctor who specialises in circumcision, because the only way to get that training is on the Muslims. That's how we're going to get the volume to be able to be good at it. I see them as they're teaching me to be really good for my Jewish patients. So the other thing that happens is that, like, I have a website for my circumcision clinic. I've had to remove all reference to any positive advantage of circumcision because the medical board has said that you're lying. And I haven't had no capacity to come back and show them evidence. I've just had to withdraw everything that says that there's some advantages in it. So the move is there, and there's a great anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim feeling about this. Probably stretches back to the Catholics from 1442, but that's what's behind it in my
view. We did circumcision on the 8th day, but the Muslims, I thought, did it about the 12th or 13th birthday.
No, they do it all over the place. Mostly they want to do it as they don't actually have a tradition of when to do it. They just do it. So
it has to be done by the 30th. It's a commonly held thing that they do it at 13, but as Dr. Levitt says, generally speaking, they want it done as soon as possible.
Today I did 10 circumcisions at my clinic, and 7 of them were Muslim, all under 8 weeks of age.
Okay, any other questions about the concept of Brit Milah and how we as Jews can try and preserve our traditions?
That's the Muslim one. I'll never. That's the thing.
Yeah, that's right, and I think that's what I said to Dr. Levitt. You know, if the Aboriginal people practice circumcision now, of course, you know, with what you started with, the acknowledgement of sensitivities of the Aboriginal, which is absolutely right, that we should acknowledge those sensitivities. Part of those sensitivities is their culture, and that's an ally. And for us in the UK, there are about 250, max 300,000 Jews in the UK, max. Okay, do you know how many Muslims there are in the UK? About 6 million. Okay, so they've got a very, very strong voice in this. And the Muslims, even the non-from Muslims, if you want to call them that, they do circumcision in the same way as the non-religious Jews also do circumcision, generally speaking. Yes, they are our allies. And you know what? They would have probably said that in Sweden as well, and in Norway and in Denmark. What starts off in Scandinavia will filter its way through Europe. Look at France, for example. You're not allowed to walk in the street with a kippah in France. You're not allowed to walk with a hijab in France in the streets. It's only one step on. Where you know, you can imagine it's not a million miles away. I hope you're right, but I don't think we can be complacent. I think you're right for the moment, but I don't think we can be complacent. We have allies, and we must use those allies, but we must also be vigilant that you know, we have to be aware that there are dangers out there. Yeah. I do think it would help, for sure, because, you know, we do need more Dr. Milah. The question is, are you going to be able to undo thousands of years of tradition? It's going to take a long time for that to happen in the Orthodox community. If you look in the Shulchan Aruch, which is our sort of go-to book of Jewish law, it is clear that a woman can do a circumcision, and if a woman does a circumcision, it is a kosher circumcision. But it is equally clear there that it's not really acceptable. Now, do I think that it should be acceptable? Doesn't matter what I think, because it's going to help. One of the problems, of course, that we have is that it will be seen as being, inverted commas, reform with a capital R, and that will put off many Orthodox people, even if they were to teach them the halacha, and let's say we all came to the halachic conclusion it was acceptable, it's got to be seen, and it will be seen as being reform. So do I think that's going to happen? Not in my lifetime, and probably not in the lifetime of anybody in this room. Do I think it would help? Yes, I think it would. Do I think it should happen? I don't know, and I'm not prepared to say, and it doesn't matter anyway, because who am I to, my opinion doesn't matter. Do I think it will happen? No, I don't.
Female Jewish doctors want to train as well. Happy with it?
I think the real problem is they won't get that experience and just practice the former Muslims.
See,
The Muslims have accepted the female.
don't know. Do they, Doctor?
Half of the world now is struggling.
Yeah.
Struggling just like the Jews.
Yeah. Okay, very, very important point. Let me just repeat the question. The question was, should we not be encouraging or should we not be discouraging the practice of Brit Milah in people's houses, in shuls? Should it not be a sterile procedure in a clinic of some description? My own feeling is yes, that is going to be necessary to preserve our Brit Milah if there is an attack, because one of the attacks will be, okay, and it's really an extension of, if it's got to be done, it should be done by a doctor. The extension, if it's got to be done, it should be done in a sterile environment. And we can't really argue against that. Our only argument against it is fact. And that is that, in fact, it doesn't get infected. And I've done over 1,000 Britot. I'm not sure how many thousand circumcisions I've done. I don't think I've done 19,000. I'm definitely not done 19,000. But I've done 1,000 Britot. And I've never had one infected. Never, not one. Okay? Now, I've done them in houses. I've done them in shuls. So it's not a great argument. I understand that. Yeah. You're absolutely right. I mean, I remember the first time as a medical student, probably many of the doctors had the same experience. My first time as a medical student in operating theatre, I missed the entire session because I kept having to re-scrub because the scrub nurse there, the sister there, saw me touch something or scratch my head or, you know, adjust my mask, go and do it again. I didn't see a thing, didn't see any operations. I saw plenty of this stuff there. You know, I know what to do with the Hibby scrub now, but didn't know anything about surgery, never learned a thing because I wasn't there. I was busy scrubbing up again. You're quite right. And again, I think that comes back to your point. If we had to give that up, doing it in schools or doing it in houses, and we had to do it in clinics, personally, I'd buy it. And I think it would not be a bad thing, because then it would be another idea of showing that we are taking this thing seriously. Do I think that would catch on, if you like? It might catch on in a community like Perth. It wouldn't catch on in London or in Manchester, where I come from, because reform, right? It's not the way it's done. It's, you know, it's not Heimish. It's not. But do I think that would be a good idea? Personally, I would certainly be prepared to accept. If somebody said to me, right, we'll leave you alone if you always do it under sterile circumstances in a clinic with gloves. Okay, it's quite hard to do the PRIA with gloves, but okay, even do it with sterile scissors if I have to. Again, it doesn't have to be done with the nails, as is traditionally done, in the same way as that metzitza doesn't have to be done with the mouth, as tradition has shown us. If that was the same, they said to me, I'll tell you what, I'll leave you alone for 50 years. As long as you do that, I'd grab their arm off. So the answer to your question is yes, I agree. Okay, I don't know whether you want me to go through the next thing about euthanasia, whether you're all had enough or... Okay, all right, so we'll put Brit and Milah to one side, and I'll talk now about the issue of end of life, particularly, of course, in view of your recent, fairly recent, I think, isn't it? This passage of this voluntary euthanasia law. It's a big problem. Voluntary euthanasia is a big problem for us Jews. There's no other way of saying it. It's a problem. Voluntary euthanasia, where you're doing a physical act to end a person's life. In Jewish law, there's only one description for that. It's murder. So I get my cards on the table straight away. That active euthanasia, by which I mean doing something in order to end somebody's life with the intention of shortening their life, according to Jewish law, is murder. And there's no wiggle room on that. Where there is wiggle room is in passive euthanasia, in withdrawal or withholding of treatments, etc. There's a very, very fuzzy area there, which I'd like to discuss. But there is no discussion to be had in halakha. You will find no rabbi, no Orthodox rabbi, who will say to you that voluntary euthanasia, the practice of doing an act in order to and causing a shortening of life, is anything other than murder. So that's probably the easiest bit of my entire talk tonight, because there is no wiggle room. You can discuss it, philosophy about it, you can discuss your own feelings about it. At the end of the day, that is the halakha. But what has changed a great deal, and I mentioned right at the beginning, my notes from 30 years ago, how old are you? 36, nearly 40 years ago, when I first started to do this, my notes are very different on this topic. Very different, because views have changed, medical opinion has changed, medical techniques have changed, and there is now a much greater understanding amongst the rabbis and amongst the poskim, those who decide Jewish law, of the idea of, and it's a very subtle idea, we have as doctors, we have, and as human beings and as Jews, we have an obligation to prolong life. There is a pasuk that we say every day, Kol HaNeshama Hallelujah. Every soul praises God. And the rabbis say, don't read this as Kol HaNeshama, every soul, but read it as Kol Neshima, every breath praises God. And the basic Jewish philosophy is that life is not qualitative. We don't talk about quality of life. I have a wonderful quality of life, Baruch Hashem. I've got plenty of money, I've got children, I've got grandchildren, I've got a house, I've got a yacht, I've got a plane, my quality of life is wonderful. You never, you haven't got a yacht and you haven't got a plane. Never, poor fellow, what kind of quality of life he's got? Not got his own private jet. Okay, he's not got his own private jet. What kind of quality of life is that? Right, Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. By the way, she never said that. But anyway, but we don't make qualitative judgments about life in Judaism. Every breath is a praise of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were. And that's the basic philosophy. But until fairly recently, there was a lot of rigidity there, and it was interpreted that we had to do whatever was necessary to prolong life. Now, that philosophy remains, but we have to make a distinction, because whilst we are enjoined to prolong life, we are not allowed to prolong death. Now, that's a tricky one. When does what we are doing as doctors, palliative care doctors, particularly palliative care doctors here? Okay. Palliative care doctors particularly, when do we transition from prolonging a life to prolonging death? And that is a very hard distinction to make, and sometimes, oftentimes, can only be made retrospectively. There's a concept in Jewish law of gesisa. Somebody is a gosses. Some of you may have heard of that expression. And what it has traditionally meant was that somebody's going to die within the next 3 days. Often we only know that retrospectively. But if we were to know that, the halacha is, a gosses, you cannot even move them, because you might prolong their death. You might prevent death from coming. There's a Mishnah which talks about a person who was dying, and there was a wood chopper outside with his axe, chopping. They sent somebody out to tell the wood chopper to stop chopping, because that wood chopping was, as it were, preventing the neshama, preventing the soul from leaving. So it was forbidden, and it is forbidden, to prolong death. Now, it's a very, very difficult distinction, this, where you transition from prolonging life, which we are enjoined to do, kol hanashima, every breath is a praise of God, to prolonging death, which is something that we must not do. Death is a natural process, but death is not instant, is it? I mean, yes, it is. Now, what's death? Let's even talk about brain death. That's another situation altogether. Brain death didn't exist 60 years ago. When did brain death come in, Professor?
60 years ago.
1968, yes? As a response to what? As a response to Christian Barnard, who did heart transplant. Suddenly, we need to have a different definition of death that we had before for the rest of history. The rest of history, death was when your heart stopped beating and your breath stopped breathing and your lungs stopped breathing. That was death. Right? Nobody put anybody in a box while their heart was still beating. Suddenly, we needed death to be redefined. After the first heart transplant, Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was the most senior halachic decisor of his generation in America, he described the process of heart transplant as a double murder. A murder of the donor, because his heart was still beating when it was taken out, and a murder of the recipient because it was inevitably going to fail, which it does, of course. Now, of course, it's only a single murder, according to that criteria. And once you're able to take out a heart after it stopped beating, and then put it in and restart it, then you haven't got any murders at all, according to that opinion. So brain death came along as a necessity after heart transplants became possible. So there's been a huge debate, and it's still ongoing, as to whether brain death is halachic death. There are many rabbis who accept brain death and will bring you many, many proofs from the Gemara and all sorts of other sources that brain death is a concept which we can live with, pardon the pun. But there are still many opinions that say no, halachic death is cardiorespiratory death. You cannot declare somebody dead until the heart stops beating. And therefore, according to that view, heart transplant would not be permitted. But I digress. So I'm only bringing that in now to show you how opinions can change. We generally speaking say, you know what, society changes, but the halakha is firm and doesn't change. It's not true. Halakha does change. It changes with knowledge. When electricity was first invented, the rabbis thought, because this is what the scientists told them, that it was problematic on Shabbat because it was completing an electrical circuit, and they had this idea of this, fire going down the wires. We now know, don't we, that electricity is nothing to do with that. It's all to do with protons and electrons and all these things moving around. They still can't use electricity on Shabbos, but that's a different story. Knowledge changes, and that has an effect on the way halakha is understood. So this idea of, for example, brain death, which was a brand new invention by the doctors for a reason, affects the way halakha is viewed. And it's the same with euthanasia as well. Passive use of euthanasia. I'm talking about passive euthanasia here. I'm talking about the withholding of medication, the withholding of life-giving oxygen or whatever it is, as opposed to a physical act. There was a chap called Dr. Moore, David Moore, in about 1980 something, if I'm not mistaken. See if I can find out when he was. I don't remember now exactly. 1980 odd. A guy in the northeast of England, in Newcastle, Dr. David Moore, who was tried in the UK for murder, because he went to the pub night and he said and admitted that he had given numerous patients morphine in high doses in order to shorten their lives. And he was dobbed into the police by somebody who overheard this, and he was tried. He was acquitted because he changed his story, and under oath he said, I gave the morphine in order to reduce their pain. As it so happens, yeah, it did shorten their life, because in this situation, that particular dose of morphine, but it wasn't why I did it. I didn't do it intentionally. And that was very much a halachic approach. The halachic approach to somebody who is at the end of their life is that we must do everything that we can to make their end of their life as comfortable as we possibly can. If, as a result of that, there is a shortening of life, then so be it. As long as that is not the intention of the act. Okay? So, a palliative care doctor or a general practitioner looking after a person dying at home, who the syringe driver on, and this person's in a great deal of pain, and they wind up the syringe driver because they're in pain, and that morphine reduces the pain, but it also, as a side effect, depresses the breathing, and that person passes away. First of all, we don't know, but let's say we know that that person passed away sooner than they would have done. That same act can, according to halakha, be the greatest mitzvah that you could possibly do to help a person have their last few moments and minutes and days and hours in this world comfortably. And if you have the wrong intention And if you have the intention that I'm going to dial up that morphine to put him out of his misery, then that's murder. So the same act, it's all about what we call in Hebrew, kavanah, intention. In English law, I suppose it's the same in Australian law. In order to have a crime, you have to have mens rea, you have to have evil intent. And if you do that same act, it can be an act of the greatest compassion, or it can be murder, according to halakha. So,
I know, like, if more help. Who knows? Where am I?
that's the dilemma, and it's all about your intention. If that person is in tremendous pain, and the only way they can be reduced from that pain is the morphine, and as a result of that morphine, their breathing will be depressed and may end their life sooner, and you're doing it in order to reduce their pain, and it's the only thing you can do to reduce their pain, then you must do it. But if you say, I can't bear to see this person suffering, I want to end his life, that's a different story. So it's all about your intention. Now you'll say, oh, well, that's one act. No, it's a huge difference. We are sentient beings. And what we consider, what we do, our kavanah, our intentions, our morals must shine through. As human beings, as Jews, we have to have morals of the highest standard. As doctors, we have to have morals of the highest standards. We have to have ethics of the highest standards. And this is really, really important. And this is the fundamental basis of halakha. So you would have found many years ago that rabbis would have said, no, you can't give them the morphine if it's going to reduce their life, because that's nowadays we understand. It's not that the halakha has changed. It's the fact that we understand medicine better, and therefore we can make interpretations of the halakha in a different way, and in a way which is more understanding. In the same way as Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, another one of the greatest decisors, changed his mind about various different halachot over the years, because he was somebody that never made an opinion halachically, never gave a halachic opinion until he had the experts in the field to come and explain to him exactly what's going on with this. Right? My own teacher of medical ethics, Rabbi Professor Abraham, some of you may have heard of him. He was a professor of cardiology in Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. Great man, still alive. And he was a very, very close pupil of this man, Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, one of the greatest rabbis of his generation, died in about 1991. He was there every single day. Reb Shlomo Zalman would call him up and say, Avram, come and explain to me such and such. Come and explain to me again. I don't understand. And he wanted to know every single bit of what was going on in the medical field with this particular question. How does this work? How does this machine work? How does this work? Until he made a decision. Halakha can only be decided on the basis of knowledge. I remember one of my teachers in the early days of computation, when we started to get computers in general practice, and they said, rubbish in, rubbish out. Right? It's only as good as the data that you put in. The halakha will only be as good as the information that the person deciding that halakha has. And it is incumbent on rabbis, and they do, to know. Today, we are very, very fortunate. We have rabbis of the highest quality, the highest caliber, who are experts in the field. Rabbi David Bleich, some of you may have heard of him, is a genius. He's a law professor. He knows more medicine than most professors of medicine. And he doesn't make an opinion until he knows exactly what's what. So the thing is not that halakha changes. That is presented in a way which is reflecting the knowledge that we have. Now, any of you seen Sleeper, the film, 1973, Woody Allen? Yeah? Okay. What happens at the beginning of that film? Right? It's a great film. Anybody who's not seen it, you have to watch it. Woody Allen wakes up after 200 years in New York, and he goes into a deli in New York, and they're all sitting there eating cream cakes and smoking. And Woody Allen, of course, the neurotic Jew, he says, "What are you doing? You're all crazy. You're going to die of lung cancer and cholesterol." And they say, where have you been? What planet are you from? We used to think that smoking was bad for you. And we used to think that cream cakes and cholesterol was bad for you. Now we know that it's all good for you. That was a parody, of course. I mean, it happens, doesn't it, in medicine? We've all come various different circles. HRT is one that comes to mind for me. You know, when I first started in general practice, HRT was protective, and then it was negative, and then it was protective. I don't know where I'm coming or going with it now. It's all the rage in the UK because Davina McCall's all pro HRT, so everyone's coming in for HRT now. Things change, and because things change, knowledge changes, and therefore the halakha moves around and changes with that knowledge. But it's all still based on that same idea that we have an obligation to preserve life, but we have a forbidden act of prolonging death. We are forbidden to prolong somebody's agony for the sake of prolonging their agony. Once the process of dying has begun, and this is learned from the halachot of Gesisa, of what we said before, once that process of dying has begun, we must allow that process of dying to take place and not interfere with it. So, for example, practical examples now, and then I'll stop and we can have a discussion. Practical examples. Somebody who has a terminal illness who develops a chest infection, which in normal events, you would treat that chest infection with simple antibiotics and they would get better from that chest infection and they would still have their terminal illness. Halakha says you treat that chest infection because that's standard medicine. Now, 70 years ago, antibiotics were not standard medicine. So that would have been heroics. We don't do heroics. We don't do futile treatments just for the sake of doing futile treatments because we want to preserve every single person that started the process of dying. Now you'll tell me, well, everyone starts the process of dying from the minute they're born. You start the process of dying. You know what I mean. When you're starting in that process at the end of life, where you're at the end of life situation, what you have to give al pi halakha, according to the halakha, is standard things. So nutrition, hydration, simple treatments like antibiotics, unless that's going to cause greater discomfort. So in other words, if, for example, a person has an infection and the only thing it's sensitive to is gentamicin, okay? And you can't take that orally and you have to give it by intramuscular injection and it hurts. And the person has a terminal illness, you are not obliged to do that. And there's a question as to whether you're allowed to cause extra pain for the person. If the person says, I want it. I have an aunt who, bli ayin hara, in 2 days' time, will be 105 years old. She is as sharp as a needle. She's very physically infirm now. She's bedbound. She's as sharp as a needle. Her memory is better than mine. And, you know, you look at her and she's lying in bed. At the age of 104, she suddenly got interested in football. I went to visit her and enjoying the World Cup. And she says, what do you think about the World Cup? I said, Auntie Liz, when were you interested in football? She said, oh, I've just got interested. I'm really into it now. I'm watching every match. Right? She's 104. She's going to be 105 in 2 days' time. Right? I'm looking at her and I'm thinking, I'm not sure if I would want to live in that situation. I'm bedbound. I can't do anything. She can no longer, she's got contracted hands now. She can't even sign a check, which is no good at all. But she can't use it. She's very disabled. You say to Auntie Lee, you know, she said, I don't want to die. No, I'm not ready to go yet. I don't have to point any further than Rabbi Coleman, 104 years old, Kanai Nahora, right? And a most amazing man. It's not quantitative here. It's not qualitative and it's not quantitative. Our job in halakha is, as doctors, is to treat people. We are given not just permission, we're given an obligation as doctors to do our best for our patients, to contribute and to care, as Dr. Levitt said right at the beginning. But that includes caring at the end of life as well. And when a person has got to a point where that, to go back to what I was saying before, they've got an infection and gentamicin is the only thing and they have to give it in the tochas and it's painful. No, you're not obliged to do that. You're not obliged to do it. If the patient wants it and they say, I don't want to die, give me the gentamicin. I don't mind. I'll have the pain. Keep me alive. I want to see my great grandson's wedding or whatever it is they want to live for. Fine. But you're not obliged to do that in that situation. You're not obliged to cause extra pain to patients to keep them alive, to prolong the process of dying. And it's a very fine distinction, and it's not something that we can discuss in an hour or half an hour. These are the kind of things that your group of doctors that you're going to get together. These are the kind of things. I've got a whole bunch of various different scenarios and case studies here that I can send to you, and you can sit around and discuss it and talk about the ethics of it. Talk about how you would deal with such and such a case, because these are the kind of things that we as human beings, as Jews, as ethical human beings, guided by halakha, these are the things that as doctors we're coming up against on a daily basis. And these are the things that we need to be putting our heads together. And again, I'll end with what I began with, and that is the encouragement to restart your Perth Doctors Association and discuss these things. Have a discussion, have different opinions put forward, learn from one another, contribute, come together, and that will only good things will come from that. Hi. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to try and answer any questions if there are any. Please feel free. I don't know I'll necessarily know the answers, but I'll try.
Before we have any questions, I'm just going to say it's 2 hours. It's a long time. We have cakes and biscuits and some sandwiches and drinks, and that perhaps what we're better off doing is allowing people to leave what they want to leave. And come and ask questions personally of Lynn, but maybe we'll just have one question.
Absolutely. Okay. %100% agree, and we can be forerunners of that. I have in my hand here part of my presentation of another. What I tried to do just now was in half an hour, condense what is a 12-week course that I've done in Jewish medical ethics. If you want to do the full 12 hours, I can send you the links. Everything's on my YouTube channel, so you can do that at your leisure if you want. What I have in my hand here is one page that says arguments for euthanasia, and another one that says arguments against euthanasia. And in there is people may feel pressured to request euthanasia by family, friends, or doctors when it isn't what they really want. Why? And my aunt is a point in question. Okay, thankfully she has, not short of funds, but she would rather have died than pay out for all the care. She thinks she's getting it for nothing because she thinks the country. If she knew that she was paying for it, she would say, you know what? Give me the injection. I don't want to pay for it. I'd rather leave the money to my children. And that's part of the argument. It sounds trite, but it's not. It's very important. The point that you raise is a very important point. It's in these things here. And we as Jewish doctors should be at the forefront of putting forward the moral view. Not talking about halakha. It's not for us to foist halakha on the non-Jewish world. What it is for us is to be a light to the nations and to show the Jewish, the outside world, the world out there, that the way forward is an ethical way, which is guided for us, is guided by our Torah. Ethics, morality, that's what the Torah is all about. As my father would say, the Torah is just one thing, Zai and Mensch. be a decent human being. Everything else is commentary.
Can I give it the thank you?